Hey guys, John Doyle here. Simone, do you want to say hi?
Hi, Simone Kraus from Germany. Nice to meet you.
We're here. We're going to talk to you. Our talk is titled Navigating the Fog of War. And really, what we're trying to do here is highlight for you guys how we can actually think through and deliver meaningful messages to our stakeholders in a time of competition and as that starts to shift to conflict. There's naturally across, I think, the base here, intellectual curiosity as conflicts in the geopolitical environment or any trigger event happen. But if it doesn't drive action, is it really relevant? Is it really worth us as a CTI analyst spending our time on? Because those are precious resources where we could allocate those otherwise. So what we have for you today is 3 different case studies that we're going to get into pretty quickly. We just want to do some expectations management up front here before we go on. So if you have heard me talk before or even engaged me today or recently, I am unapologetic. That is not going to change for the purpose of this talk. Simone's going to be the good cop, I'll be the bad cop for putting in that context. We do have some pretty serious messages to talk through. Some of these topics are a little bit sensitive depending on who you're talking to. We will be as objective as possible. So hence what this talk will not be. I know I work with a lot of teams. I'm a consultant by trade, so I work with a lot of teams. I get to see what their practices look like, how they're thinking about what thresholds are for what they should write and why they should write. Normally, we don't run into geopolitical tensions rising too much. However, in recent days, and as we go through kind of the case studies and the chronology here, you'll find that this is becoming more and more routine. So having a playbook and having a structure in place for how and what and why and when we message becomes all the more important. And that, as we go through each of these different kind of conflicts or kind of flashpoints, will allow us to start to think through, well, what does this actually mean? What does that threshold get to? By the end of this talk, so 2 of the 3 case studies we've kind of seen, we've experienced, we've been reporting on. One we haven't. So we want to give you a framing reference or a framing mechanism that will allow you guys to start to think about how do we apply this and how are these all a little bit different, but how do they share similar characteristics across each other? I don't know. You got anything else?
I think you perfectly described it.
That's very, very nice of you. See, good cop. All right, so we do have some framing, just some background context, which we included here for continuity more than anything else. You all are here with us at the summit, either virtually or in attendance, so you've gotten to hear some of the feedback, some of the messaging from our previous speakers. Where there's duplication of material, we will move through that pretty quickly. However, for the purpose of a standalone presentation in the future, we do and have included some of this. So here is where I bridge generational gaps with this meme. All right, what would you say you do here? Me and my colleagues, some of which are in the audience right now, typically work with CTI teams, and boy, you get some real weird answers, and sometimes you get some looks where you're like, I don't really know how to codify this. So we've given you a starting point, right? So us as analysts, we focus quite a little bit on understanding the context of the adversaries, their intent, their behavior, their capabilities, some of the things that were kind of discussed during the keynote. And then we take our expertise, we internalize it, and then we present it in a frame of reference that maps and aligns to our stakeholders. Right? That's going to vary based on the stakeholders, based on their experiences, and there's a whole line of cognitive psychology we could talk about, but not right now. The teams we tend to work with, we suggest that they have a portfolio of production. If that's a service line, if that is a product line. Oh, I'm getting yelled at, Rick?
Oh, no, get yelled at. We're just getting feedback from your mic, so I'm just gonna see if I could give you a hand mic, then just have you talk into it, but we don't get the scratch. Sorry to interrupt your flow.
Is this better? Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me back there? Okay, cool.
Make sure to project into it.
Maybe we could do like a coffee shop. You can give me snaps or something instead of claps. All right, cool. Fantastic. My apologies for any scratchiness that came through the recording. I am going to pivot now to using this mic. There you go, Bartek. Now I'm not getting kicked out of the signal chat. All right. Product line, service line. Here we go. So oftentimes we tend to have this depicted in pretty pictures. For most teams, I also recommend having an Excel spreadsheet. But the purpose, the message, what we're really trying to convey here is
There is a recurring series of products that we typically put out based on our stakeholders and our intelligence requirements, things that are tried and true, things that we know about. Then there's these ad hoc requests. I'm of the mindset that these geopolitical conflicts are not going away. So thinking about this from the perspective of continuity and driving business operations and shaping our decisions, we move from a time in which these were RFIs, one-offs coming in, to a more regular type of request that we might need to think about what that looks like moving forward and how we support it. Here's the interesting thing. While we think about adversaries, while we think about their operations and the impact they have, we have to kind of remind ourselves that actors have priorities too. So I probably should have worn my Attribution Matters shirt, missed opportunity, but since I didn't, I will go ahead and I'll just kind of codify that really quickly for us. Actors have priorities, especially when we're looking at geopolitics. They have full-time jobs, they want to get promoted, they want to achieve mission objectives, much like a lot of us are driven by the mission here. How can we help protect? They are driven by the mission of how can I help inform and strategically position my organization, my client, my government to be the most advantageous. So in a short form, all of these end up being a little bit different, and it's a shifting target. So I really like hearing about the anticipatory nature and the mindset that we're thinking. Rick's wife doing threat modeling and all that fun stuff. Sorry, Rick. When we move through the examination of Russia, China, Iran, there are different dynamics that we need to take into account. Some of these end up being cultural. Some of these are just kind of the nature of the way these countries and their intelligence services and militaries have developed. Oh, that didn't come out right on the slides. That's fine. For those who come from a more technical background, digital forensics, computer science, you might not have been exposed to things in international relations. However, in this field, it's a nice intersection of geopolitics, IT, cybersecurity, and a host of other disciplines. Some of the models we typically use as we're examining the powers, the national elements, the power projection elements, find themselves in these models. I could spend a good 3 hours with you guys on this, but we don't have time. So instead, I want you to think about cyber as an enabler. Cyber as a key function that is used to support information operations, to support military objectives, to support economic objectives, because as we move through each of these case studies, that's going to become abundantly clear. And in this first one that Simone's going to talk about in just a second, we'll focus pretty heavily on how there's an integration across all of these different national drivers, if you will. I will skip through this, but we have given you an enumeration of what adversary intent and goals might look like. And simply say, over the last decade or so, we've seen an evolution happen. We've seen an evolution and a shift happen where adversaries have started to pivot and test what typically were red lines, understanding what is kind of acceptable in times of what we'll call competition, which is kind of status quo, and then times of rising conflict. We are seeing an uptick in disruptive type activities, especially when we get to that more kind of time of conflict scenario. And hat tip to the folks over at Airbus who put this graphic together. It's a bit dated at this point, cut off at 2021, which actually shows a chronology of different types of attacks, focused mostly on destructive attacks that we've seen all the way dating back to 2010. And you can start to project here, if we were to put this on a bar chart, the uptick in the trend. One last thing from me before I turn it over to Simone for the interesting stuff. What we know about adversaries, their goals, their intentions, their thresholds, how they've conducted operations in the past, actually changes. It changes when you get to a wartime scenario. So we flip our notion of risk reward, or if we look at it through that prism, we then start to understand how adversaries can adapt. And adapting might mean burning accesses that were previously in place, burning tooling that otherwise is very customized and very expensive for them to recast and recreate. And that's a nice tee up for Simone, who's going to give us the German perspective, something we haven't really talked about or seen publicized on the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Thank you, John. Great summary. So, when the conflict started, Russia thought it's a 3-day operation. And after 1,000 days, we see it's continuing. So what we see here is a great example, what John was talking about, the DIMFL, Russia's operational methods against Germany and Western democracies. We see here this from the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz. It's published last week, and I thought it perfectly fits into what we're showing here. We heard yesterday about the anticipatory intelligence, means the world is complex. And to understand such conflicts, it makes sense to make the perspective for your country, how Russia's operating. So on the one hand, you see the targeted sectors. So the question is, are you involved into such a conflict? Does it bother you? And I thought this is a great opportunity to show here we have got the targeted sectors and the part of non-state actor, and on the other hand, Russia's direct influence of state control monitoring areas, for example, the oppression of non-systemic oppositions or other hybrid measures. What I think should be seen also more as state control area is the Russian hacktivism. We will talk about it later. And then we see also the Russian intelligence support to the invasion, that we've got several units operating in this area. So the GRU unit 29155 has not only operated in the cyberspace, but also in the kinetic and non-kinetic. They are targeting countries systematically. They do influence operations, and we see APT-28 and APT-44. And what was very interesting also in your research, that hacktivist groups are operating together with the GRU. So they are definitely nation-state actor or sponsored by nation-state actor. This is not totally new. Maybe you would like also to summarize the GRU's information confrontation doctrine.
Sure. So as we shift perspective, and when we think about this from, for most of us in the room right now, our Western parlance, we're looking at warfighting domains, space, air, so on and so forth, and cyber being a function through all of them. Russia has a slightly different mindset where they view effects. So if I conduct a cyber operation, it has an impact. That's kind of the Western philosophy, whereas Russia is looking at it from the right to left. How do I have this impact, and what do I have in my toolkit in order to actually achieve those objectives? This actually comes down to Russian doctrine, but it's just a shift in our perspective, which is one of the reasons why understanding the adversaries, their intent, their nationalistic doctrine, and how they operationalize that, or as close to it as possible, becomes such a useful tool in our toolbox as analysts. So the information confrontation doctrine really kind of falls across that hybrid spectrum. Whereas we would take electronic warfare, we would take cyber operations, we would take information operations or disinformation, and those would be uncoupled. In the Russian space, it's actually co-joined together as a function of achieving an objective in things that live online. There's a lot more to that, and I don't think I did it full justice there, but I also don't want to take away from your time.
Okay, and then what's very interesting is how the GRU is recruiting, influencing, and leveraging hacktivists. This is only a summary of the alliances that we see and campaigns in December. And what is also very interesting in this context, that it's not totally new. We saw it 2007 in Estonia and 2008 in Georgia, that hacktivists had influence or influence with operations. But what we see now, that these alliances are integrated. So it means, for example, also pro-Palestinian narratives. They fight together as alliances, and this is a modern hacktivism. It changed. It's not like the hacktivism we see before, that angry mobster are anti-governmental operating. It's the shift that we see that these hacktivist groups are operating together with this nation-state actor, that they are sponsored, and that they have campaigns specifically. For example, we see they target 2 days a country, and then these alliances operate together for the same goal. We have here, for example, a targeting of a public transportation. What is the goal? So always from the perspective of Russia, they try to influence us. It's not only that they attack on the one hand technically, but on the other hand, to change our perception. And they do this while they over-exaggerate the situation. We've got here, for example, the economic damage that they tried through disruption and narrative shaping. For example, when they target a public transportation. So the short-term impact is the disruption of public-facing assets, and the question if the economic damage is that high. But long-term seen, if they do that on a daily basis, targeting specific countries with DDoS and influencing or trying to influence the audiences, they erode the trust, and they try also to intimidate. This is the shift of societal perception long-term that can have a huge impact on all of us. Another great example is the blending capabilities when they do the smear campaign against specific politician or before election, totally out of context. For example, here we have a diplomatic partnership damage that they try to achieve, talking to several countries, and then taking this narrative additionally to target the country with the election, for example, or a smear campaign. So here the short term would be the disruption again, but long term is the degrade the trust between partners, and is also what they would like to achieve and create the wedge in ideological areas of disagreement. Another great example here is where in context of the Ukraine ad, we see here, for example, the F-16 fighter jets as DDoS missiles. So also the semantics are important. They know exactly. We saw it. You do the pestle and dime fill on the one hand as an analyst, on the other side, these countries are also prepared. They know exactly your language, they understand your culture, and they specifically attack your culture, your language, your audience. And here we have the F-16 fighter versus the shaping military decisions through coercion, intimidation, and disruption. So if you give Ukraine the ad, we will punish you. We will intimidate you, and you will have also economical losses. This means short-term, the delay or disrupt of military support. It can also be an attack, for example, on logistics and supply, DDoS attacks. It can be the information operation, and likely long-term impact, it changes the society perception again. So if we help, we will be maybe intimidated. So maybe we shouldn't help any longer. Create a precedence that limits future flexibility. So recap, what can we say? It was not only a 3 days operation, and Russia thought it will be a 3-day operation. From the German perspective seen, they had this peaceful coexistence approach. to win hearts and minds. We had politicians working close together with Russia. We were dependent on oil and gas, and they were expecting that would be a 3-day operation because we're dependent on them. And while they made the experience, okay, Germany is pro-NATO, is an ally, they also started to target us. But the perception was not in the beginning that Russia is an enemy or an opponent, and they haven't even believed in Germany that there could be a conflict. So I think Germany has not seen the competition and the rising conflict. So times of competition and conflict, and Russia has taken that as an opportunity. So recap, what can we learn? It's an uptick in scope and scale of operation. The espionage, destruction, disruption on the one hand, but also the psychological aspect that we see, and it's overseen, I think, in many analysis. It's the DDoS attacks on a daily basis, but not only the DDoS attacks, you see in parallel the influence that they try to achieve with the DDoS attacks. The DDoS attacks maybe have not the impact they communicate, but the stories around these attacks could influence long-term the perception or change the perception of such attacks. And we see in modern hacktivism these new alliances for integrated operations ongoing, also between other countries and other goals. For example, the pro-Palestinian narrative. So when do you write an intelligence update?
Yeah, so that's the tough question. So we've been at it for 1,000 days in this war. There's a lot been going on a daily basis. Surely there's intellectual curiosity and interest from your CISO, from some of your partner teams. What's the threshold? What's the threshold for you guys to actually write an update, to keep track of the narrative? We have finite messaging, we have finite political clout. So if we start to send the same message, nothing significant to report day in and day out, we kind of lose relevance. If we give periodic messaging on a basis in which we're actually demonstrating impact, we're giving warning, we're giving opportunities, that then becomes more meaningful. So as we go through these case studies, think about as an invasion starts, there's usually some threat modeling that we go through in our own minds. Are we impacted? Is this relevant? If it is relevant, what type of actions can we take to prepare our defenses? Do we have business operations in a specific geography? Are we going to be collateral damage? And these are all questions that are apropos for any CTI team to consider and to be asking of the business. So it's very important to have that alignment there.
And we try to understand historically the campaigns that we've seen and what is ongoing, also to translate into a technical understanding.
Yep. So as I steal that from you. Thank you. As we move forward and we start to think about during a time of conflict, if we have identified, yes, this is relevant, yes, we are impacted by it, that's when we start to shift. That's when we start to create the playbooks from the historical actor groups that we've been tracking, from what we've seen in the past from an impact perspective, because we have to baseline. We have to start somewhere. But that really quickly gets us to our second case study. The Iran conflict, and I can't talk about Iran without actually talking about regional proxies and kind of proxy wars that exist there. Iran has several proxies that it kind of props up in the region. Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, the Assad regime until that just collapsed, and the Shias in Iraq, all of which had been receiving in one way, shape, or form Iranian support from their government, whether it's military, economic, and even in cyber, whether it's advisement for their programs. Usually not tool sharing, but we can kind of dole that out and start to see it. Since 1979, when the Iranian Revolution happened, there's been a very contentious relationship that exists with Israel, where the current party that runs Iran does not view Israel as a sovereign state. That, as you can imagine, has played out in a few different ways. Overt tensions have not kind of started to surface in the past 20 or so years. There's a very rich context here, but because of that, there's been this tit for tat happening, especially in the last few years with cyber operations in terms of disruptive and destructive attacks. This is all context for the current Hamas conflict with Israel. Just to say that these have existed for a while, and this is just a escalation of tensions, but this notion of a war that's happening back and forth has existed. You'll look at the slides later, you'll have the data points there for you, so no need to take pictures now. Microsoft actually did a really good job with one of their blogs. So hat tip to Mystic, hat tip to their other threat intel team, the context threat team there, where they actually pulled this together and they said, all right, what's the overlay? So much like in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we saw this notion of hybrid war amplification using cyber operations, espionage, disruption, and amplification through information operations. Is that similar? Has something like that played out in this? The answer is kind of yes, kind of no. Microsoft has a very detailed blog on it, so I'm only going to point you to these graphics really quickly and say we have seen an amplification of effects through what's called cyber-enabled operations. So a cyber attack happens, or a compromise happens, and then there is an amplification, whether true or not true, within information operations campaign to support, not at the scope or scale of Russia, however it exists. As the conflict happened, though, it wasn't just Israel that Iran was going after or supporting. The way they go about doing support is direct. So either direct support to their proxies or on behalf of. So Iranian cyber operations against Western allies, the US in particular, are on the table, and we're on the table. And that's one of the things that we point out here that might get lost if you're not following the regional context here. But it's not new, right? Iran typically has used destructive and disruptive attacks in the past, dating back to 2011, to voice displeasure. Something happens in what we call meat space in the real world, and there is a retaliatory measure taken inside of cyberspace, if you will. 2011 was DDoS attacks against US banks. Then we started seeing regional destructive attacks with Shamoon back in 2012, and this continues to play out. Some of the more notable operations that have taken place since this attack against PLCs and HMIs against water and energy sector for Israeli-made software. It's almost like they took a page out of the playbook with Russia with NotPetya, only this is a little different in the targeting scope and scale. But it's not the only one. And I wish I had more time to talk about this. I really don't. So we can see if we're looking at this advisor, even the US government's kind of come out publicly and said, looks like they're trying to work with ransomware actors for the intense purpose of not actually collecting money, but just kind of being jerks, but maybe giving plausible deniability to that through the guise of what looked like ransomware. It's a technical term there. And again, credit goes to Microsoft for actually laying a lot of this out on timelines for us to make our lives a little bit easier as analysts as we're trying to summarize the collation of all of the different types of effects that have taken part throughout this conflict. Very good when we're doing a sit rep or trying to give an update to our stakeholders. So if I quickly recap there, we're not looking at 1,000 days now. We're not looking at what was supposed to be a 3-day conflict. We're looking at one that is much shorter and bucketed. The regional dynamics actually play a role, but we can ask ourselves the same questions that we were in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Is this relevant to us? Do we have operations? Do we have partnerships? Do we have suppliers? Do we have contractors that we use? Are we part of a high-risk industry? Are we defense? Are we high-tech? Are we supporting comms? Do we have an ISP? So on and so forth. To understand whether or not we might find ourselves within the notional blast radius. And as I start to pivot now to our very last case study, we're looking at a flashpoint that has yet to happen, but is starting to simmer. And this really involves China and Taiwan. So even as Simone and I were talking about and conceiving this talk, I'm gonna call you out here. Please don't hate me for this one. It's like, well, of course, it's like economic. That's all China does. They do economic stuff. And it's like, actually, history, no offense,
No.
history tells kind of a slightly different story. China has a very long institutional knowledge base. China remembers things dating back hundreds and thousands of years as a civilization. And I'm not going to go into it. Don't worry, this is not a history lesson. All that it is, and I've tricked you into that with this talk. If we look back in the history books, though, the origin story of Taiwan actually comes from a conflict and then a separation between two different parties inside of China. Taiwan named itself the Republic of China, and in response, mainland China said, no, 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 we are the People's Republic. So there's been this tit and tat for about 100 years now. So this ends up being one of the things that's called a 5 poison. So inside of the Chinese system, there are 5 existential threats to the regime, to the CCP. Taiwan is one of these 5 poisons. So the context in which China has used or reserved the rights to use destructive type capabilities from their cyber arsenal is a little different, though. Iran seems to use it as a projection of power to voice displeasure. Russia uses it in a military context or in a high-value target strategy. China, we really haven't seen much of in the way of wiper-type attacks or even DDoS attacks, with the exception of their Great Cannon at one time. But here we are. So what historical context can we actually draw from in which, in a time of conflict, or as we're approaching conflict, China would be willing to use something else in their arsenal? Now, as we talked about these conflicts, we probably should have been very explicit. Cyber is one component. So there's usually things happening in military space, in diplomatic engagements, coercion or shaping of economic conditions, all to get to a point where you de-escalate conflict. Taiwan has been and continues to be a victim of cyber operations from various Chinese groups. Over here on the right-hand side, I took this poll about a year ago from historical context. These are all the different groups we saw operating against different entities inside of Taiwan. Interestingly, we also saw China actually relax their reserves a little bit, if you will, change their operational calculus in response to a perceived aggression from the US. So when Nancy Pelosi and members of the House went over to visit Taiwan after China waved their finger and said, no, you will not, they did anyways, there was a retaliatory response. And it came in the form of a military exercise happening off the coast of Taiwan with their Navy. And then also there was a cyber component, the message, this is not okay. So we're already seeing what some of this might look like as conflict ratchets up. And there are a few things in the broader backdrop that we should be aware of. We've already talked about it. Jonah did a great job talking about kind of orb networks at the very beginning of his talk. The centralization of some of the infrastructure that is being used by multiple different Chinese groups, the strategic placement of various Chinese groups on critical infrastructure for what's known as prepositioning in the event of a conflict, and then also the reorg from last year from the strategic support forces to the information support forces. And we're still seeing that kind of play out right now. Does that mean that there's going to be more control, more centralization over the direction of operations, more deconfliction between different operational groups? And this is something that we're monitoring and we're thinking about. So as we wrap up, we want to kind of turn it back to you to think about, with all of these changes, with all of these shifts happening, what do you message and when and how? One of the teams I was working with at one point had some presence inside of Russia, and they were asking us like, Can you just brainstorm with me? Can you threat model with me what it means if we pull our business operations out of Russia in the middle of this conflict? Are we going to be victims of their on-network operators going pew pew against my organization? It's like, guys, come on. Can we be real for a second? They've got finite resources. They're fighting a war. What makes you think you're going to raise to their threshold? Same thing in the China-Taiwan context here. We have to be asking ourselves, is there relevance? What does disruption look like? If it hits a threshold, what is the adversary's potential capabilities and willingness? And how does that impact us? I usually advise CTI teams as they're thinking about stakeholder support, focus on things that will drive actions in an organization. Everything else gets deprioritized. It's a lower priority, even if it comes in from the CISO. That's expectation management from your bosses. They need to know when to push back and how to push back. So really where we want to leave you is with this. If a flashpoint happens, and we've just gone through 3 case studies where we've seen 2 flashpoints occur within the last few years, and this one that is simmering, how would you respond? How would your organization be impacted? And then what can you do about it? So I am John, this is Simone. We probably don't have time for questions if we want to get you to lunch on time, but drop them in the chat, or if you're here in person, come find us. We're happy to talk to you. Thank you guys for the time.
Thank you.